Boston winter 1942. In the long corridors of Harvard University, hurried footsteps echoed, blending with the whistling wind outside the windows. World War II was raging across both Europe and the Pacific, and America had joined the conflict less than a year after Pearl Harbor. In classrooms and laboratories, the usual air of scholarship had been replaced by tension, by the awareness that every scientific discovery might now become a weapon. Louis Fieser, just 35 years old, a professor of chemistry, stood in a room filled with the sharp smell of gasoline. Before him lay test tubes, beakers, and cooking pots repurposed from the organic chemistry lab. His face was stern, yet his eyes burned with curiosity. Fieser was not a soldier nor a politician. He was simply a scientist. But ever since the Department of Defense had reached out to him, his life had taken a new turn. The Americans faced a grave problem. Japanese fortifications scattered across Pacific islands were built into caves, reinforced bunkers, even dug deep underground. Conventional bombs only gouged craters and raised clouds of dust, unable to pierce stone or concrete. The military needed something that could flow, seep into every crevice, cling and burn the enemy alive, a fire that could not be extinguished by water. Fieser and his research team began their work. They tested dozens of formulas, mixing gasoline with chemical compounds to make it thicker, more viscous. The idea was to transform volatile liquid fuel into a burning gel that could be packed into bombs and, when detonated, would cling to any surface. "We need a fire that crawls," Fieser often told his student assistants. "A fire that doesn't just flare up, but spreads, clings, and devours everything." Their first test did not take place inside a sealed room, but right on Harvard's football field. At midday, the team set a metal drum in the middle of the grass, filled with the new mixture. They ran a long wire, triggered the charge. In an instant, a column of orange-red flame shot upward, its heat searing faces even dozens of meters away. Unlike ordinary gasoline, the fire didn't flash and die. It flowed, clung to the ground, burned relentlessly, thick black smoke billowing skyward. A student gasped, "My God, it won't go out." Even Fieser stood stunned. He knew he had just opened the door to a weapon the world had never seen before. This substance could turn an entire neighborhood into an inferno within minutes. In the following weeks, they refined the formula, adding aluminum salts of naphthenic and palmitic acids. Harmless as they sounded, when combined with gasoline, they produced a dense, sticky gel. The name napalm emerged from this union, naphthenate, and palmitate. A short, cold word, but one that carried unmatched destructive power. News soon reached Washington. The U.S. military wasted no time. Mass production. Industrial lines sprang up across America, thousands of napalm bombs manufactured and packed into M69 steel casings, compact, easily dropped from bombers. Fieser watched the process unfold with a sense of scientific pride. He told himself, "This is the tool needed to end the war faster." But deep in his mind, unease lingered. A formula on paper, a chemical reaction in a lab. Could it become a nightmare for tens of thousands of human beings? He had no answer, nor dared think too far ahead. War demanded it. Science in the service of survival. By 1943, the first barrels of napalm left the factories, loaded onto warships bound for the Pacific. Officers who had never seen such a weapon received simple instructions: it will burn longer, spread wider, and cannot be extinguished with water. A brief introduction, enough to instill both curiosity and dread. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Japanese troops dug deeper tunnels, built stronger bunkers, convinced they could hold out forever. They had no idea that in Harvard, a fire had been born, one destined to turn their fortresses into hell. One December evening in 1942, as winter snow blanketed the banks of the Charles River, Fieser sat alone in his office. Outside, students sang Christmas carols, warm golden lights glowing through the windows. He stared at the faint blue flame atop an alcohol lamp and thought, with just a few drops of chemicals, the world can change. He remembered that first burst of napalm on the football field, brilliant, fierce, almost alive. It was no longer mere fuel, but a living beast. And he, Louis Fieser, was the one who had awakened it. Beyond Harvard's gates, war demanded blood and fire. And that fire, sooner or later, would escape into the world, not only to consume enemy bunkers, but to haunt humanity for decades to come. Summer 1943, across the vast ocean, convoys of American ships carried napalm bombs through rough waves bound for the Pacific. In their holds, thousands of M69s were stacked neatly like giant cans of gasoline, silently awaiting their moment of ignition. None of the sailors fully understood what they carried. They only heard the orders. Be careful. Don't let any fuse catch fire. These are not ordinary bombs. In Hawaii, where bomber squadrons assembled before heading to battle, a group of officers attended a special training session. On the table lay a single M69, looking no different from a small steel drum. The lieutenant colonel in charge slowly unlocked it, pulled the fuse, and set it down. He explained, "Inside is not high explosive, but a thick incendiary. When the bomb falls, the fuse ignites, the steel shell bursts, and this substance is thrown out. It sticks to anything it touches. Wood, steel, flesh, and it burns. Water cannot put it out. Only sand or cutting off all oxygen might stop it." A young officer, swallowing hard, asked, "How dangerous is it for civilians?" The room fell silent. The instructor answered flatly, "War does not distinguish who stands under a bomb. Your mission is to end it as quickly as possible." In August 1943, napalm was used in combat for the first time. On the jungled slopes of Guadalcanal, U.S. Marines advanced against a hill where Japanese troops had dug in. Behind them, American soldiers carried modified flamethrowers filled not with ordinary gasoline but with napalm. When needed, they opened the valve, pulled the trigger. A stream of fire shot out like a red serpent, twisting through the air before slamming into the bunkers. Unlike gasoline flames, this fire did not die against damp grass or rock walls. It clung, seeped into cracks, crawled down foxholes, devouring everything. Screams rang out, thick black smoke coiled skyward. The Americans stood watching, eyes wide. None had ever seen a fire so alive. One corporal muttered, "My God, it's like a monster." Within minutes the hill went silent. Charred Japanese bodies lay scattered, fortifications reduced to ash. The Marines climbed up, shivering and relieved at once. The job was done faster than they had imagined. News of the success spread. The U.S. military saw napalm's tactical value. Not only could it destroy bunkers, it could seed an unshakable fear in the enemy. No hiding place was safe, no survival when the fire crawled inside. From 1943 to 1944, napalm testing expanded. At Pacific bases, American troops practiced dropping M69s on mock-ups of Japanese villages built from bamboo and wood. Once ignited, the fire spread with the wind, consuming the entire settlement in minutes. Specialists took meticulous notes: temperature, burn radius, duration. The results were clear. If hundreds of such bombs fell on a city, in just a few hours, vast areas would be reduced to ashes. In Washington, generals began thinking ahead. They knew Nazi Germany would collapse eventually, but Japan still clung stubbornly to the fight. Islands like Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa were filled with bunkers and caves, defended by soldiers ready to die rather than surrender. A direct assault would mean horrific losses. One army general stated bluntly in a meeting, "We need something that frightens them enough to lay down their weapons," and napalm became the answer. Meanwhile, in Europe, napalm bombs were also tested. In 1944, during the Normandy campaign, U.S. and British aircraft dropped them on forests sheltering German troops. The flames rose high, burning trees to cinders, turning hideouts into infernos. American soldiers recalled skies blotted out by dense smoke, the smell of burning flesh drifting for miles. Some German survivors, later captured, admitted, "We were used to bombs exploding, but that fire substance, it terrified us. No one dared run because if you ran, the fire stuck. Inside you died. Outside you died." By June 1944, as D-Day began, napalm was not a primary weapon but had already proven its power. In subsequent assaults, especially against fortifications, its use grew steadily. On the battlefield, American soldiers felt torn. On one hand, napalm saved their lives. Just a few flamethrower bursts could clear enemy positions that otherwise required brutal close combat. On the other, many were haunted by the sight of enemies burning alive. They described screams, blackened figures stumbling before collapsing. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We're no longer fighting people. We throw fire, and the fire kills for us." In U.S. laboratories, Louis Fieser still received reports from the front. He read the figures. Fortifications destroyed, areas burned, casualties. Sometimes photographs were attached. Hills stripped bare, bunkers shattered, bodies curled and blackened. Fieser pondered. He knew his creation was proving far more effective than expected, but he also understood. From now on, his name would forever be tied to a fire that never died. In a letter to a colleague, he confessed, "I no longer control it. Napalm now belongs to the military, and it will go far beyond any laboratory." Winter 1944. In Washington, strategists began sketching plans for napalm on the largest scale, not just in jungles, not just on battlefields, but in the heart of Japanese cities. Wooden city mock-ups were built in Utah, burned, and studied. The results stunned everyone. With just one squadron of B-29s carrying tens of thousands of M-69s, an entire city could be erased in a single night. And from that moment, the Harvard fire ceased to be a tactical weapon. It had become a strategic one, about to write one of the most devastating chapters of World War II. In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, less than 1,200 kilometers from Japan, a small island rose like a dark scar amid the blue sea. This was Iwo Jima, a volcanic island barely 10 kilometers long, yet lying directly on the vital flight path of B-29 raids against Tokyo. The Americans understood if they could seize it, bomber crews would have a place for emergency landings, and fighters could take off from there to escort the bombers. The Japanese understood it as well, and so they turned Iwo Jima into a fortress of steel. Beneath the island's hard volcanic rock, the Japanese dug tens of kilometers of tunnels, connecting bunkers, gun emplacements, and ammunition depots. They had turned almost the entire island into an underground labyrinth. Every crevice, every hill concealed machine guns and mortars. At the top stood General Kuribayashi Tadamichi, a cold, resolute commander who knew he could not win, but who intended to make the Americans pay in blood. February 19, 1945, aboard hundreds of American warships, more than 70,000 Marines waited. Ahead, Iwo Jima had been bombarded for 72 hours by naval guns and aircraft. Black smoke covered the sky. Many soldiers believed no one could have survived on the island, but Kuribayashi had given strict orders. Not a single shot until the enemy sets foot on shore. When the landing craft doors dropped, Marines rushed onto the volcanic island's black sands. And then the world erupted. From the heights, from hidden tunnels, machine guns, mortars, and artillery opened fire all at once. Bullets tore the air, black sand exploded upward, blood turned the beach red. Within hours, thousands of Americans had fallen. One private later recalled, "We thought we were marching into hell, and in truth, we were." Faced with such ferocious resistance, the Americans unleashed everything they had: flamethrower tanks, artillery, bombers. But Iwo Jima was not the jungles of Guadalcanal or Saipan. This was hardened volcanic rock riddled with tunnels. Bombs fell, flames spread, but the fires only scorched the surface. Underground, the Japanese waited unharmed, ready to strike back. It was then that napalm became the ace up the Americans' sleeve. Waves of B-24s, B-25s, and later B-29s dropped thousands of M69 bombs, filled with napalm, onto the island. From above, American troops watched as rocky slopes erupted in fire, flames crawling into fissures, black smoke rising in towering columns like a nightmare. A Marine lieutenant described it. "Regular bombs explode and that's it, but napalm bombs are different. They screech, they burst into fire, they cling to the rock, and they burn for hours. The flames crawl into caves, into tunnels, turning the air into a furnace. Even from a distance we felt the heat searing our skin." In countless battles, Marines advanced yard by yard into the Japanese tunnel system. Ahead lay total darkness, hidden machine guns, the echo of Banzai in the stone. They carried flamethrowers loaded with napalm. Crouching low, they aimed the nozzle into the tunnel mouth and squeezed the trigger. A long tongue of fire roared out, glowing red, sealing the entrance. In the confined space, the temperature soared above 1,000 degrees. Inside, gunfire ceased. Only the hiss of flames and cracking rock remained. Many Marines later admitted, "We didn't want to face them directly. The fire did it for us. Terrifying, but without it, we would have been the ones dead." Day after day, the struggle dragged on. Napalm, flamethrower tanks, naval bombardment. Everything was hurled into the fight. Yet Kuribayashi held on. The Japanese no longer rushed into suicidal charges. They stayed hidden underground, striking only when the Americans exposed themselves, then vanishing back into darkness. Every foot of ground cost lives. On the beaches, American and Japanese corpses lay side by side. The heat of napalm made the black sands blistering, many bodies charred beyond recognition. Marines used shovels to cover them with sand, to mask the stench and to smother smoldering flames. An American medic wrote in his notebook, "Napalm saved us by breaking the enemy's tunnels, but it also haunted us. The burns, the blackened bodies, no one could forget." On February 23, 1945, after 4 days of brutal fighting, Marines finally seized Mount Suribachi, the symbol of Iwo Jima. The raising of the American flag on its summit was captured in the photograph that spread across the world. Yet the battle was far from over. For weeks, Japanese troops continued to hold out in the northern tunnels, fighting to the last bullet. Each time the Americans discovered an entrance, the cycle repeated: flamethrowers, napalm bombs, fire and smoke rushing inside. There was no escape. Many Japanese soldiers chose death by fire rather than surrender. By the time Iwo Jima fell, nearly 7,000 Americans were dead, more than 20,000 wounded. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only a little over 200 were taken alive. The rest died, in bombardments, in the flames of napalm, or by their own hands. For the U.S. military, it was one of the bloodiest battles in history. But it also proved that napalm, horrific as it was the most effective weapon against the supposedly impenetrable tunnel system. One American general later admitted, "Without napalm and flamethrowers, we might have lost double or even triple the number of men." After Iwo Jima, the entire Pacific understood the message. If Japan was determined to defend every inch of ground, the United States was prepared to burn through every obstacle. And the next step was already planned. A firestorm unlike anything the world had ever seen, aimed straight at the heart of Japan. In March 1945, the Pacific was flooded with American power. From the recently captured islands, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, the B-29 Superfortress bombers could now reach the very heart of Japan. That was the decisive range. General Curtis LeMay, commander of the Strategic Bombing Force, believed the moment to bring down the enemy had arrived. But before him lay a daunting problem. For months, squadrons of B-29s had dropped thousands of tons of high-explosive bombs on Tokyo and other major cities. Yet the results were frustratingly meager. Thick clouds, monsoon rains, and fierce winds off the Pacific regularly pushed bombs far from their targets. Japan's industrial plants still stood and weapons production continued. LeMay realized if they stuck to the old methods, the war would drag on without end. He chose a new path, harsher, more absolute. On March 9, 1945, at the Guam Air Base, LeMay gathered his commanders. The plan laid on the table carried the code name Operation Meeting House. The objective was no longer factories, docks, or military depots, but the entire city of Tokyo, home to more than 1.6 million people. Instead of explosives, he ordered the planes to carry M69 napalm incendiaries. Each small bomb, the length of an arm, was packed with napalm gel and flammable oil, bundled in clusters. When dropped, they burst apart, spraying sticky flames that seeped into rooftops and alleys alike. One young officer asked nervously, "Sir, this target holds hundreds of thousands of civilians. How many will we kill?" LeMay answered coldly, "The more, the quicker the war ends. Every extra day costs thousands of American lives. If I have to choose, I choose Tokyo in flames." That night, March 9-10, 1945, 334 B-29s lifted off from Saipan and Guam, carrying more than 1,600 tons of napalm. Unlike the daylight raids before, this time they flew at night and at low altitude, barely 1,500 meters. No more tight, disciplined formations. LeMay ordered his pilots to spread out, drop lower, and bomb with greater precision. Around 12:30 a.m., the lead aircraft pierced Tokyo's night sky. Below lay a vast city cloaked in blackout darkness. When the first napalm cluster detonated, streaks of red fire burst outward, latching onto wooden and paper homes. Within minutes, tiny blazes linked together, weaving into a glowing net. Then the firestorm began. Hundreds of B-29s followed, showering incendiaries like rain. In just an hour, 2,000 tons of napalm transformed Shitamachi, Tokyo's densely packed wooden district, into a sea of fire. Strong winds from Tokyo Bay fanned the flames into roaring funnels. Heat soared to 1,000 degrees CC, making the air rise like molten steel. When wind and heat combined, a terrifying phenomenon appeared: a firestorm. The flames whirled, sucking oxygen away, creating winds of 5,100 km/h. Civilians tried to flee, but the fire drew them back toward its core. Many collapsed from suffocation, only to be swallowed by the flames. A survivor recalled, "The whole street turned into a furnace. I saw mothers clutching children leap into the river, but the water boiled. Wooden boats burst into flames on the surface." The cries of people mixed with the howling wind, as if Tokyo itself had become hell. Within 3 hours, 41 square kilometers of the city, nearly all of Shitamachi, were obliterated. Canals brimmed with bodies. Many victims hadn't burned but suffocated, collapsing in the streets with faces turned purple. From above, American pilots saw a vast red glow consuming the ground. One remembered, "We looked down and it seemed the whole city was a giant forge. The stench of burning rose so strong we smelled it even inside the cockpit." Some pilots returned in silence. They knew they had just taken part in the deadliest air raid in human history, carried out in a single night. By morning, March 10th, Tokyo lay in ashes. Rescue teams walked through the rubble, past thousands of charred, shriveled corpses, blackened like statues of coal. At least 100,000 civilians were killed in one night. Over 1 million were left homeless. The survivors wandered in shock, faces gray with ash, eyes hollow. An elderly woman whispered, "We feared bombs, but we never imagined man could make a fire stronger than a volcano." To LeMay, Operation Meeting House was a brilliant success. He reported to Washington that Tokyo's industry was paralyzed and Japanese morale shaken. In a single raid, the U.S. had inflicted more casualties than both atomic bombs would combined. From then on, napalm firebombing became the main weapon. Over the next 3 months, B-29s incinerated Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama. Dozens of Japanese cities went up in flames. Hundreds of thousands more died. But the price was not borne by the Japanese alone. Many American airmen returned carrying unspoken scars. One lieutenant confessed in his diary, "They gave me a medal for killing the most people in a single night. But in my sleep, I fall into the fire with them. I don't know if it was victory or a crime." Tokyo's Meeting House raid became a horrific testament to the power of napalm. It was not just a weapon, but a warning. When science becomes a tool of war, an entire city can vanish in a single night. And this was only the beginning. In the months to come, as Tokyo and Japan's great cities turned to ash, an even more terrible weapon was being tested in New Mexico. A weapon not merely to burn neighborhoods, but one capable of ending civilization itself. After the night Tokyo went up in flames, Japan no longer knew a single moment of peace. In the weeks that followed, the sky constantly rumbled with the roar of B-29 engines, and red firestorms erupted across cities without end. General Curtis LeMay's new strategy had become a nightmare. No longer precision strikes on factories or depots, but waves of incendiaries unleashed over entire residential districts where people and production were interwoven. On March 13th and 14th, Osaka, the second largest industrial hub of Japan, was swallowed by fire. More than 4,000 people were killed, nearly a quarter of the city wiped out. Flames from the tightly packed wooden houses joined into one vast inferno, turning the streets into a blazing hell. Citizens fled to the river, but the smoke-thickened waters claimed many lives. Some drowned, others were caught by the flames spreading across the surface. A week later, Kobe and Nagoya met the same fate. Winds carried ash and the stench of burning flesh for tens of kilometers. In just 4 months, from March to July 1945, more than 60 Japanese cities were relentlessly bombed. Yokohama, Kawasaki, Fukuoka, Hiroshima, Toyama, each name appeared in turn on LeMay's target maps. Every mission sent out hundreds of B-29s, dropping thousands of tons of napalm and high explosives on crowded neighborhoods. Toyama was burned to 99% of its area, almost erased from the map. Yokohama, the nation's second-largest port city, lost 42% of its land in a single night, with over 8,000 dead. For civilians, there was nowhere left to hide. Underground shelters built to withstand high explosives became tombs once napalm flames slipped through cracks. Rivers, lakes, and canals were the only refuge, but boiling water and choking smoke suffocated many on the surface. Children became separated, the elderly abandoned, families torn apart in the chaos. Even small railway towns were not spared, for any place with a workshop or storage depot drew American fire. In Tokyo, survivors returning after the March firestorm faced fresh raids. In May, the city ignited again, another 4,000 lives lost, tens of thousands of homes reduced to rubble. Night after night, the glow of burning cities was so bright it could be seen hundreds of kilometers away. Japan was slowly turning into a map scarred with crimson burns. By late July 1945, statistics revealed that more than a quarter of Japan's urban area had been completely destroyed. At least 300,000 civilians were dead, millions homeless, the economy paralyzed. Trains overflowed with refugees wandering from region to region with no safe haven. In the countryside, makeshift straw huts sheltered the displaced, but medicine and food were critically scarce. Meanwhile, inside government chambers, fierce arguments erupted. Some generals stubbornly clung to the will to fight to the death, convinced that any American landing on Kyushu or Honshu would exact an unbearable cost. They calculated that millions of soldiers and civilians could be sacrificed for an honorable peace settlement. Yet with each day, each night, the rising death toll turned such dreams into illusions. American airmen were also swept into this cycle of destruction. Returning from each mission, they reported vast firestorms and cities vanished. Some recorded in their diaries the eerie brilliance of flames lighting the clouds. But orders were orders. They were reminded that the faster Japan's resistance was annihilated, the fewer Americans would die in the coming invasion. By July 1945, as the summer heat bore down, Japan was not only under fire but also strangled at sea. The U.S. Navy had severed nearly all supply lines, leaving food and raw materials depleted. In Tokyo, people ate weeds, potato peels, even tree bark. Children grew thin, their eyes hollow from hunger. A once mighty nation was reduced to starving ruins. Yet Japan's Supreme Council still refused surrender. They hoped the Soviet Union might act as a mediator, or at least stall the Allied assault to buy time. They did not know that, at that very moment in New Mexico, a weapon far more terrible than napalm awaited, one that would not just set cities ablaze but obliterate them with a single flash. From March to July 1945, Japan drowned in fire, dozens of cities reduced to ash, hundreds of thousands of civilians dead. But the tragedy was not over. The darkest shadow still lay ahead, when a man-made sun would rise over Hiroshima. As Japanese cities burned in seas of fire from incendiary raids, out in the Pacific, the fiercest battle of the entire theater was unfolding, the Battle of Okinawa. This was not just an island, it was the last stepping stone before Kyushu, the gateway to Japan itself. Whoever controlled Okinawa held the direct road to the heart of the Empire of the Rising Sun. On April 1, 1945, U.S. Marines and Army troops stormed ashore on Okinawa's western beaches. Contrary to initial fears, the landings were surprisingly easy. No heavy artillery fire, no suicidal Japanese charges like at Iwo Jima or Tarawa. But the silence was only the calm before the storm. The Japanese had shifted tactics. Rather than dying in waves on the beaches, they withdrew deep into tunnels, caves, and mountain fortresses, waiting for the Americans to grind forward into their traps. Okinawa quickly descended into a nightmare. Its limestone hills riddled with natural caves gave the defenders ideal strongholds. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese forces, had prepared hundreds of kilometers of tunnels and fortifications with concealed machine guns, mortars, and artillery. The Americans, despite overwhelming manpower and firepower, had to claw their way forward step by step through mud, rain, and blood. In early April, Shuri Castle, the core of Japan's defense, became a furnace of battle. Every ridge and ravine was soaked in blood. U.S. troops dubbed it the meat grinder. They unleashed naval bombardments, B-29 bombing runs, and flamethrowers to root out resistance. Yet each time one cave was destroyed, another nearby sprang to life. The vast underground network meant progress was measured in mere meters. At sea and in the skies, the U.S. Navy faced the largest kamikaze assault in history. Thousands of young Japanese pilots crashed their bomb-laden planes into American warships. From April to June, more than 1,500 kamikazes were launched. Hundreds of U.S. ships were hit, many sunk, and thousands of sailors burned to death at sea. For the first time, America's mighty Fifth Fleet trembled under the ferocity of this desperate onslaught. For Okinawan civilians, this was hell on earth. Of a population of about 300,000, the majority were dragged into the fighting. They were trapped between two armies, forced to share caves with Japanese soldiers, or driven to serve as human shields. Japanese propaganda spread the terror that Americans would rape and kill indiscriminately, pushing many families into mass suicides to preserve honor. Meanwhile, U.S. bombardments flattened villages, schools, and farmland alike. By the battle's end, at least 100,000 Okinawan civilians were dead, nearly one-third of the island's population. By late May, after weeks of slaughter around Shuri, Japanese forces were exhausted. Their defensive lines collapsed piece by piece, but still they fought to the last. Knowing defeat was certain, General Ushijima followed samurai tradition. At dawn on June 22, 1945, he committed ritual suicide alongside his chief of staff. The Battle of Okinawa officially ended, but the cost was staggering. The U.S. lost more than 12,000 troops killed and nearly 50,000 wounded. The Japanese garrison was virtually annihilated, about 100,000 soldiers killed. With over 100,000 civilians dead as well, Okinawa stood as one of the bloodiest battles of World War II. From Okinawa, Kyushu lay less than 600 kilometers away. The Pentagon immediately began planning Operation Downfall, the direct invasion of Japan, scheduled for late 1945. U.S. generals estimated that conquering the home islands might cost 500,000 to 1 million American lives. Okinawa had proven this was no exaggeration. If one small island could cripple the U.S. fleet, the invasion of Japan itself promised horrors beyond imagination. Meanwhile, in America, some scientists and military leaders pressed the government to find another way. And that alternative, a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen, was ready after secret tests in the deserts of New Mexico. As Japan reeled in the agony of Okinawa, another deadly dawn was preparing to rise: Hiroshima. August 1945 marked the final blood-soaked chapter of history. When the Battle of Okinawa ended, the world knew Japan was exhausted, its military was worn down, industry paralyzed, civilians starving, and cities reduced to ashes under incendiary bombs. Yet Japan's leaders still clung stubbornly to the notion of preserving the national polity, hoping to prolong the war long enough to negotiate favorable terms. Meanwhile, in the United States, President Harry Truman faced a grim choice: either launch a full-scale invasion of Japan at the cost of millions of lives, or unleash a new weapon, the atomic bomb, the secret product of years of work under the Manhattan Project. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima's sky was clear. At 8:15 a.m., the B-29 Enola Gay dropped the bomb, Little Boy. In an instant, the city was consumed by a massive fireball. Temperatures of thousands of degrees Celsius incinerated everything within kilometers. 80,000 people died immediately, and tens of thousands more perished in agony from radiation. 3 days later, on August 9th, Nagasaki was struck by Fat Man, the second bomb. On August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan, sending the Red Army sweeping into Manchuria and crushing the once mighty Kwantung Army. Attacked from both sides, nuclear devastation from the United States, and invasion from the Soviet Union, Japan had no escape. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation over the radio for the first time, his trembling voice admitting defeat. Japan surrendered unconditionally. The guns of World War II finally fell silent after 6 years of blood and fire, with more than 70 million dead across the globe. The aftermath was another chapter, one of pain and rebirth. Japan lay in ruins, millions homeless, its economy shattered. Meanwhile, the U.S. occupied the country and launched sweeping reforms, dismantling the military, drafting a new constitution, and initiating democratization. The scars of war burned deep in memory. Hiroshima and Nagasaki stood as terrifying symbols of nuclear power, while Okinawa remained a blood-soaked reminder of desperation. For humanity, the legacy of those final days was not simply victory or defeat. It was a warning. Modern war no longer distinguishes between battlefield and city, between soldier and child. The flames of incendiary bombs, the steel of fortresses, and the nuclear flash above Japan drew a new boundary line for civilization. From that moment, the world had escaped one global catastrophe, only to step into the Cold War, with the shadow of nuclear weapons hanging over every nation. Japan would later achieve a miraculous recovery, rising as an economic powerhouse. Yet the memory of August 1945 never faded. Each year, the peace bells toll in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, reminding the world that the end of war is not glory, but ashes, and the enduring legacy is a promise, never to let such a catastrophe happen again.